Welcome everyone to the session Managing Tallgrass Prairies in a Changing Climate, Insights from Field Experimentation. As a quick reminder again for everyone to please use the Q&A box on the right for all questions, and the chat function can be used for all other comments. Today, I'm delighted to introduce you all to this session's presenter, Katherine Charton. Katherine is an applied ecologist studying how climate and disturbance shape plant communities to inform adaptive management strategies. At the Institute of the Environment and Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, her work explores how climate change impacts prescribed fire burn windows in Midwest ecosystems through biophysical and social science approaches. Welcome, Katherine.
Thank you for the introduction, Sarah, and thanks to those of you that are joining today. I'm really excited to be here and share some of my research with you, primarily work I did while a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin, and a brief preview of what I'm working on now as a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Minnesota. To start off, I want to acknowledge something many of you already know. Our world is undergoing rapid and unprecedented global change. Global change is a broad term, but it captures the wide-ranging effects that human activities have on the environment, including the degradation of natural habitats, meaning they're no longer as healthy or functional as they once were, the fragmentation of habitats, where once continuous landscapes are broken into smaller, isolated patches, climate change, which is driving shifts in temperature, precipitation, and weather patterns due to greenhouse gas emissions, and biodiversity loss, the decline of plant and animal species due to all of these combined factors. Since industrialization, we've seen staggering losses, around 40% of natural habitat and 20% of species globally. This is why conservation, restoration, and management are so critical. Our goal as stewards of the environment isn't just to slow these losses, but where possible to restore ecosystems to healthier states. The urgency to do so is so great that the United Nations has declared this the decade on ecosystem restoration. As a quick note, I'll largely be using conservation, restoration, and management interchangeably throughout this talk, because while they're distinct, they are all strategies for supporting ecosystems under global change. And moreover, I'm going to specifically focus on climate change as a key aspect of global change that we can address through management. But while climate and other global change makes management necessary, it also makes it more complicated. A great example comes from my own research, looking at how different management strategies impact a common issue, woody encroachment, which we'll discuss more in depth in a moment. One widely used strategy for managing woody species is chemical intervention. That is, applying herbicides to remove encroaching shrubs like the gray dogwood depicted here. On the horizontal axis of this graph, we have two groups, areas where no chemical intervention has occurred and areas where chemical intervention was applied. The vertical axis represents changes in the amount of gray dogwood cover after management or lack thereof. And each dot in blue represents a data point. The black markers show the average of those data points and an error, the line around that estimate. The dotted horizontal line denotes no change in gray dogwood cover. So you can see that without management, gray dogwood cover increases, while with management, it decreases. Note, though, that this is all under normal or ambient conditions. Under simulated drought conditions, we still see that no management leads to increases in gray dogwood, and management tends to reduce gray dogwood. However, the results are much more variable. In extreme cases, choosing not to manage under drought leads to explosive growth in gray dogwood, while management under drought might be much less effective than expected under ambient conditions. And these management effects don't just impact a single species like gray dogwood. They also have downstream consequences for broader environmental conditions, which in turn shapes whole communities. Environmental conditions are a key driver of what species can persist in an ecosystem, especially for plants, which can't just pick up and move when conditions change. To illustrate this, let's think about all the different plant species that might arrive in an ecosystem through dispersal. First, they face abiotic filters, things like moisture and light availability. If conditions aren't right, those species won't survive, filtering them out of the ecosystem. Next, they encounter biotic filters, interactions with other species like reliance on pollinators or competition with other plants. Collectively, these filters determine what species are found in the community we observe. However, climate change is modifying these conditions. It can strengthen them, making it harder for certain species to establish, weaken them, allowing species to move in, or shift them entirely, leading to communities that look very different from what we've seen in the past. For example, in this illustration, what started as a 7-species community shifts into a different 5-species mix under these altered environmental conditions. So one of the key goals of management is to restore environmental conditions that support the historical composition of communities. That brings us to 3 key research questions that I'm going to talk about today to guide management in a changing world. First, how does management influence environmental conditions? Second, how does it affect plant diversity and function? And third, how does climate change alter these management effects on environmental conditions and plant diversity and function? Here's a simple way to visualize these questions as relationships. The first looks at how management directly alters environmental conditions. The second considers both the direct effects of management on plant diversity and function, as well as the indirect effects mediated through environmental change. The third question introduces climate change, which can directly influence management, environmental conditions, and plant diversity and function, but also has indirect ripple effects throughout the system. To complicate this already complicated model further, this all plays out in a specific landscape context and over multiple years, as many of these processes take time to unfold. Note that of all these factors, the only one we have direct control over, at least at a local scale, is management, which is why I've called it out in this gray box. For the rest of this talk, I'll focus on 2 experimental projects using this model that explore these dynamics in different ways. First, how woody plant management interacts with drought across a moisture gradient over a 3-year study. And second, how fire seasonality and reduced winter snowpack influences a recent prairie restoration over a 7-year study. Before we dive into those experiments, though, let's take another step back and talk about why this kind of research matters in the habitat we all love as prairie enthusiasts. Grasslands are one of the most threatened ecosystems in the world. Globally, we've lost over 50% of native grasslands, more than any other biome. And despite this, only about 5% of remaining intact grasslands are protected, making them one of the most degraded but least conserved ecosystems worldwide. In North America, the losses are even more extreme. This map shows the historical extent of tallgrass prairie in green, which once stretched from Texas through the Midwest into Manitoba. Today, we've lost over 90% of it, with remaining patches again shown here in green. And in regions like southern Wisconsin and southeastern Minnesota, where the prairie enthusiasts work, less than 1% remains, most tiny, scattered fragments that don't even show up on a map of this scale. This makes effective prairie management all the more important. One of the biggest challenges we face in tallgrass prairie and other grassland management is woody encroachment, which I alluded to a moment ago. A well-known example is from Yosemite Valley, where an open grass and wildflower-dominated meadow has become densely wooded over the past century. The increase of woody plant cover in habitats historically dominated by grasses and wildflowers is happening faster in tallgrass prairies than anywhere else in North America, with woody cover increasing by more than 1.5% each year. Woody plants aren't inherently bad, but they can alter grassland habitat conditions in plant communities. For example, the patchy distribution of grasses in this photo shows how many plants struggle to grow under dense shrub canopies. This can lead to a decline in diversity and associated ecosystem services such as water filtration and runoff. And that's why managing woody encroachment is one of the priorities for grassland conservation. There are a lot of factors that contribute to woody encroachment, but one of the most relevant to our region is the loss of historical disturbance regimes, especially fire. This map shows how frequently burned areas of Wisconsin burned before European colonization. And I apologize that the colors here might be tricky for some, but it's showing in red in the southern part of Wisconsin that burns historically occurred every 3 to 5 years. If you look at this region's rich soils, warm summers, and reliable rainfall, you might expect we'd have more woody plants, but frequent fire prevented most woody species from establishing, allowing grasses and wildflowers to dominate. And I want to emphasize that fire didn't just happen. It was actively managed for millennia. Across the world, grasslands and other fire-prone ecosystems have been shaped by the stewardship of indigenous peoples. In southern Wisconsin, that includes the Ho-Chunk and Potawatomi nations, and in southeastern Minnesota, where I currently live, the Dakota. Forced removal of indigenous communities from these landscapes also meant the loss of their fire stewardship. Thus, following European colonization, fire has become much less frequent. This third map shows modern fire return intervals. Compared to the historical pattern, we see far less fire overall, as represented by the increase in white areas, and it happens much less frequently, shown in oranges and yellows instead of red. And even in places where we've reintroduced prescribed fires, like many of the prairie enthusiast properties, the impact of past fire suppression is still playing out. Woody plants that survived fire-free for many years are now large enough to withstand burns and continue spreading, often through their root systems. This raises an important question. How can we best manage encroachment, especially in prairies where fire isn't enough? To answer this, my collaborators and I designed a distributed field experiment across multiple sites in southern Wisconsin. We selected 7 remnant prairies, shown on the map here, all which are actively managed with fire, yet still experience some ongoing woody encroachment. On this map, you'll see the sites are color-coded to represent a moisture gradient, ranging from dry prairies to mesic ones, which are just wetter than dry sites, but not truly wet prairies. This moisture gradient is important because managers regularly deal with habitat variation, and we wanted to understand how these differences might affect management outcomes. For those of you in the Empire Sauk region, you might recognize 2 of these sites, Black Earth Redmond and Hauser Road Prairies, which represent the first, this photo, and third driest sites on this gradient. At each of these sites, we identified gray dogwood as a common encroaching species. Even though it's a native woody plant, it's a great resprouter and can spread really aggressively through its underground roots, often making it a species of management concern. So at each of these sites, we identified patches where gray dogwood canopy cover was around 30 to 40%. And then within each of these patches, we randomly selected locations for 8 32 square meter plots to test different management approaches. 2 of these plots at each site were left completely unmanaged for the duration of our study, serving as controls. In the other 6 plots, we applied management treatments for 2 consecutive years at the start of the growing season, right after a dormant season fire, targeting gray dogwood as the focal species, but also managing any additional encroaching species we might encounter, such as European buckthorn. We tested 3 different types of management strategies. First, a physical intervention, where we manually clipped woody stems down to the soil level using hand clippers. That's what's pictured on the before and after photos on the left, and you can see a pretty dramatic drop in the amount of woody biomass in that area. Second, we tested a chemical intervention where we used a fine mist sprayer to apply foliar herbicide directly to gray dogwood leaves. And third, a combined physical and chemical intervention where we first cut the stems to the ground and then used a brush to apply a cut stem herbicide. Many of you have probably used one or all of these strategies for woody encroachment in the past. We monitored the effects of these treatments over the next 3 years in smaller 1 square meter subplots nested within these larger experimental plots to minimize any edge effects of these treatments. Large-scale experiments like this do not happen in isolation. They're a lot of work and they depend on collaboration between land managers and scientists. I was incredibly fortunate to work with a number of experienced land managers, including perhaps some familiar faces to the prairie enthusiast folks, Tom and Kathy Brock, and Randy Hoffman, who's not actually pictured, current and former prairie enthusiast land stewards. Their knowledge and expertise were instrumental in shaping this research. I was also fortunate to have an amazing group of undergraduates who helped brave the elements and implement treatments and collect data. Their hard work, passion, and enthusiasm makes this research possible. And I want to acknowledge my co-authors on this work, Doctors Ellen Damshin and Kate McCullough, who played a key role in guiding the research questions and interpretation of the data. Also, all of this is possible because of structural and financial support from a number of organizations, again, including the prairie enthusiasts. Before we move on to how these treatments affected environmental conditions and plant diversity and function, let's first look at how effective they were at reducing woody encroachment. Similar to the first graph I showed you, this graph shows management treatments on the horizontal axis and the percent cover of gray dogwood on the vertical axis. At each point, you'll see that each point is going to represent a study plot with colors indicating position along the moisture gradient. Though for many of the results today, the moisture gradient did not have strong influences on management outcomes. We found that chemical treatments, both alone and in combination with physical removal, were highly effective at reducing gray dogwood cover. On average, these plots had 16% less woody cover than unmanaged plots, and in some cases, cover was close to zero after 3 years of monitoring. You'll notice letters above each treatment group on a number of the graphs you'll see today. These indicate statistical significance. If two groups share the same letter, that means they're not significantly different from each other, but when the letters differ, it means that there is a significant difference based on the statistical models we ran. It might seem somewhat surprising that physical intervention alone wasn't very effective, but as I've mentioned, gray dogwood is a great resprouting plant, meaning it can regrow from its root system even after being cut to the ground. Without chemical intervention targeting those below ground reserves, we did see anecdotally a lot of resprouting. In one case, one stem even seemingly grew from this crack in a rock, showing just how hardy they are. So while physical intervention might seem like an appealing management choice from a cost and labor perspective, without herbicide or other tactics like repeatedly cutting stems for multiple years, it's unlikely to be a good long-term solution, at least for this particular woody encroaching species. Now let's revisit our first key question. How does management affect environmental conditions? Previous research from other regions has shown that encroached grasslands tend to have lower light availability, cooler temperatures, and wetter soils compared to open grassland habitat, which is kind of intuitive given the shade that woody plants tend to cast. Based on this, we predicted that management would increase light and temperature and decrease soil moisture relative to unmanaged areas. This graph again has that same horizontal axis showing you different management treatments, but now on the vertical axis, we measured canopy openness, which is a proxy for light availability using hemispherical photos taken at the soil surface. As expected, management had fairly low light availability due to dense woody cover, which you can see in the hemispherical photo. This is an example from just one plot. We did find, however, that the combined effect of chemical and physical intervention significantly increased light availability relative to these unmanaged conditions, leading to 23% more light on average, reaching the surface of the soil. However, while chemical intervention alone was enough to reduce woody cover, it was not sufficient to increase light levels. These hemispherical photos, the most recent one that just popped up, shows you that you can see some of the standing stems of the gray dogwood even after it's been managed and the leaves fall off. So the persistence of those stems continues to help with the shading and might be a reason that we didn't see full restoration of light following this management approach. While I won't show any additional graphs here, I'll also just throw out that we did see a marginal increase in summer air temperatures in the plant canopy across all three management types, physical, chemical, and their combination, but only by about 1 degree Fahrenheit. And we also saw a marginal decrease in surface soil moisture in the combined physical and chemical treatment, but only about a 4% reduction in volumetric soil moisture. Now let's revisit our second key question. How does management affect plant diversity and function? One of the core goals of restoration is to bring prairies closer to their historical levels of community diversity and function, which is generally rather high, but known to degrade with encroachment. The most straightforward way to measure diversity is to count the number of species in each plot, which I'm showing you just a handful of the species that I could identify from a photo of this plot months later. We can also take a more advanced approach by considering not just how many species are present, but also their relative abundances. Surprisingly, though, no matter which way we measured diversity, we did not find a significant difference in diversity metrics across these management treatments. But that doesn't mean nothing was happening. Species are likely still moving into and out of the plots as environmental conditions changed following management, which we just looked at. But that wasn't happening in ways that led to clear patterns in overall diversity. Instead, we suspected that there were species-specific responses. And one way to assess this is through plant function. By looking at functional groups where species share similar traits, we can gain a clearer picture of how plant communities are responding to these management treatments. When considering plant functional groups, we found that introduced species were actually more abundant in plots treated with chemical or the combined physical and chemical intervention than in unmanaged plots, leading to 14% more introduced species cover on average. This is largely driven by a significant increase in C3 grasses in these same plots. C3 refers to the type of photosynthetic pathway that these plants use that allows them to grow earlier in the year when temperatures are cooler, unlike C4 grasses, which thrive in warmer conditions and typically dominate prairies. For example, big blue stem Indian grass, those are C4 grasses, not C3. Importantly, our management treatments were applied in the late spring to early summer, right when C3 species would be most actively growing. And so this may have given them an advantage in responding quickly to the newly available space before C4 grasses could establish. We also saw a marginal increase in species with long-lived and clonal life histories, plants that spread vegetatively rather than relying on seeds. This means that species that increased were likely already present in or near the plots and were quickly able to take advantage of that newly available space following management. Anecdotally, this was species like smooth brome, Kentucky bluegrass, and reed canary grass that thrived after management. And these are already fairly widespread invaders, even in high quality prairie. So while management created windows of opportunity for establishment, it didn't necessarily benefit the species we're typically aiming to promote in restoration, such as C4 grasses and native wildflowers. Of course, it's important to remember that this is a relatively short-term experiment. We monitored impacts for 3 years. So over a longer time scale, altered environmental conditions may still benefit slower establishing native plants. Before I move on to our third key question, I want to provide a bit more context on why we consider drought as a particularly relevant climate change impact to consider when evaluating woody plant management. In our region and other temperate regions like it, climate change is not expected to dramatically reduce total summer rainfall as depicted here. However, it will change how and when the rain falls. We're likely to see more extreme precipitation events, meaning the same amount of rain will fall over fewer days, leading to longer dry periods in between. At the same time, summers are expected to be about 5 degrees warmer Fahrenheit, which will increase evaporation and moisture demand, amplifying these drought-like effects. This is especially meaningful for plants which rely on water to grow, but they do so in very different ways. Prior research has shown that woody plants primarily rely on deep soil water, with about 50% of their water uptake coming from deeper sources and only about 20% from shallow soil. In contrast, grasses rely heavily on shallow soil moisture, with 50% coming from those surface layers and only 20% from deep soil. This means that grasses are highly efficient at rapidly using water as it enters the system, but they may become more vulnerable when shallow soils remain dry for those prolonged periods, as is expected under future conditions. In contrast, woody plants can access that deep soil moisture, and that may remain available even when surface layers dry out, potentially giving them a competitive advantage. We don't know much, however, about the water usage of wildflowers, or more precisely, forbs, which is the botanical term for herbaceous non-grass plants. While forbs aren't the dominant plant group in grasslands, they make up the majority of plant diversity and play important ecological roles, including providing pollination resources. A better understanding of how forbs access water could help predict how drought might impact plant community composition in the future. So within this same experiment, I also tested how drought interacts with woody plant management. To do this, I focused on a subset of sites, selecting one that represented drier conditions and one that represented more mesic, that's moderately moist conditions. We used the same experimental setup, but with one key difference. Half the plots were now left to ambient conditions, while the other half were experimentally droughted using rainout shelters that captured and diverted rain away from our plots throughout the growing season. Rather than showing you more graphs, I'll just let these photos speak for themselves, taken at the same site and at the same time of year. The impacts of drought is fairly visually obvious, with the vegetation under the rainout shelter here appearing much browner and less abundant. On average, our simulated drought plots were about 2 degrees Fahrenheit warmer and had 20% drier soils than the ambient conditions neighboring them. The rainout shelters used to simulate drought were installed for 2 consecutive growing seasons following the second year of woody plant management, and their effects were assessed just in the final year of our study, but at multiple time points throughout that summer. Since chemical intervention was the primary driver of changes in woody plant abundance, I'll focus just on 2 main treatment groups going forward: plots without chemical intervention, which was the unmanaged and physical plots, and plots with chemical intervention alone and in combination with physical. This makes it easier to interpret how drought interacts with the most effective management strategy, which was some form of chemical intervention. Again, going to quickly acknowledge the immense effort that went into making this part of the experiment happen. In addition to the management collaborators and field crews I already mentioned, I had an incredible support from volunteers, many friends and family who generously helped collect data and build rainout shelters. Understanding plant water use requires measurements taken just before sunrise when plants aren't photosynthesizing to serve as a comparison point for how much water they're using during the day. So I was very grateful to have some caffeine-fueled company on those middle-of-the-night excursions to the prairie. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge my co-authors again, and especially Kate McCullough, and her lab group, who played a huge role in helping me learn the physiological measurement techniques you'll see in the following slide. Now let's return to our third key question for effective management of tallgrass prairies under climate change. How does climate change alter environmental conditions in plant form and function? I'm going to focus on the function piece of this specifically for this experiment. To explore this, we measured how individual plants responded to the combined effects of management and drought rather than looking at whole community responses, because individual physiological measurements can be more sensitive to environmental change. That means we can measure them shortly after these treatment applications and use that information to infer how management and drought over a longer period might eventually influence the broader community. We did this across different plant functional groups, particularly interested in forbs, because as I mentioned earlier, we know so little about their water use in this system. For the woody plant group, we again focused on gray dogwood. For the forbs, we split them into two groups based on their abundance in the community. The dominant forbs were two species of sunflowers, stiff and sawtooth. And the subdominant forbs were from the same plant family, the asters, and included rough blazing star and Canada goldenrod. While we measured multiple physiological responses on numerous individuals in these groups, today I'm just going to focus on photosynthetic rate. That's what ANET on this vertical axis stands for. It tells us how quickly a plant acquires carbon from the atmosphere. The more carbon a plant can take up, the more energy it has for growth and survival, indicated by higher values on the vertical axis. And as I mentioned, we grouped the management categories into two categories: plots without chemical intervention and plots with chemical intervention. As before, you'll see we use blue and yellow for dry sites, but now we're also introducing filled and unfilled points to distinguish between ambient conditions and droughted conditions, respectively. Surprisingly, we found that photosynthetic rates were slightly higher with chemical intervention. So when the gray dogwood is being managed, it's doing better, at least based on these photosynthetic rates. But this might just be a compensatory response, where shrubs in these treated plots are investing more effort into fewer remaining and surviving leaves, increasing their photosynthetic activity. Drought had no clear effect on woody plants undergoing management. It neither weakened nor enhanced their response, suggesting that they're pretty resilient to drought conditions. For dominant forbs, we observed a marginal decrease in photosynthetic rates under drought, but only in unmanaged plots. In managed plots, this drought effect disappeared, potentially because the removal of woody plants freed up water resources, allowing these dominant forbs to compensate for the lack of rainfall. In subdominant forbs, however, we saw a much stronger drought effect regardless of management, suggesting that they are more vulnerable to water scarcity. Because these species have less competitive advantage for scarce water resources, prolonged drought could negatively affect their growth and persistence over time. Interestingly, this was one of the few cases where site conditions really mattered. Notice that for both the dominant and subdominant forbs, they had consistently lower photosynthetic rates at the dry sites represented in yellow than in the blue sites, the mesic sites, which was an interactive effect with drought. This suggests that drier sites may experience greater community composition change under drought and other types of climate change. Okay, so to wrap up this experiment, let's revisit these key questions with some takeaways. First, restoring historical environmental conditions required both physical and chemical intervention. However, it's important to note that this is in reference to unmanaged encroached conditions. An important next step would be to consider how these conditions compare to a reference prairie and whether additional structural intervention is needed to fully restore those environmental conditions expected of a prairie plant community. Second, chemical intervention created space for new species, but it was opportunistic invasives that were able to first take advantage of that. That said, it's possible over the longer term, slower growing native species will establish, but in the short term, additional intervention may be needed, such as weeding or selective herbicide application for those non-woody plants, non-woody invasives, or even active seeding of target species. Finally, management helped dominant forbs withstand drought, which is great, but those subdominant forbs were vulnerable regardless of management. This suggests that removing woody plants can help retain some of the resilience in prairie systems by allowing certain species to better tolerate stress, but loss of other less resilient species may still alter community composition over time. In reference to our original framework, so far we've explored how woody plant management influences environmental conditions in plant communities and how climate change, specifically drought, alters those management effects. Our second experiment takes a different approach to understanding the interaction between management and climate, this time through the lens of fire seasonality and snowpack reduction. I'm going to focus in this experiment less on the direct effects of management from fire partially because of time and partially because there's a lot of literature on fire seasonality already outside of the context of climate change. So we'll just jump directly into how fire seasonality interfaces with reduced snowpack. To understand how fire and snowpack interact, we first need to consider, though, the role of fire in litter accumulation. Let's walk through a hypothetical year in a prairie. Imagine we start at the end of the growing season with bare soil, meaning no litter or standing vegetation is present. Come spring, vegetation begins to emerge, growing from seeds and buds and gradually filling in the prairie over the course of the season. By the end of the season, as plants senesce, meaning they have completed their annual life cycle and are starting to die back, we see litter start to accumulate, forming a layer of dead plant material on the soil surface. If nothing disturbs that litter over the dormant season, it will persist into the next growing season, with new vegetation emerging around and through it. While some litter is beneficial because it can provide nutrients and moisture retention, prior research has shown that too much litter can suppress seedling and bud emergence and limit the establishment of new vegetation, ultimately lowering grassland productivity. For this reason, managing litter through fire has become a key strategy for management, along with its other benefits, such as controlling woody encroachment and promoting flowering. If fire occurs before or during the growing season, it removes that old litter, but allows new litter to accumulate through the rest of the growing season. This aligns with historical indigenous fire regimes where fires were thought to most often be set in spring or summer, maintaining open grasslands while still allowing litter to build up before winter. Meaning that come spring, we have a decent layer of litter accumulated. However, if fire occurs after the growing season, but before plants start regrowing, it removes both standing dead vegetation and accumulated litter, leaving bare soil exposed throughout the winter. This matters because litter acts as an insulator, buffering temperature extremes and influencing when and how plants emerge in the spring. By altering litter levels, fire seasonality may shape cold exposure, and this definitely matters with the changing winter conditions we're experiencing. Winter conditions are changing most in northern or very far southern latitudes. In Wisconsin, winter temperatures are expected to increase by about 7 degrees Fahrenheit over the next 20 to 40 years. That's a ton. But this warming means that more precipitation will fall as rain instead of snow, and that any snow that does fall will melt more quickly, preventing the buildup of a stable snowpack. This has counterintuitive effects for the temperature that seeds and buds experience at the soil's surface. Because snow, like litter, acts as an insulator in the winter, keeping soil temperatures relatively warm and stable. When snowpack is deep and persistent, like this huge shelf of snowpack a couple feet tall we found, temperatures remain more moderate and there's less extreme cold exposure. But with less snowpack, soils are more exposed to air temperature, leading to more frequent temperature fluctuations and colder overall conditions, and especially extreme conditions. This makes the role of fire in litter dynamics even more critical because in the absence of snow, litter may be the only insulating layer left to protect overwintering plants from cold stress. To test how fire seasonality and reduced snowpack interact, my collaborators and I recently conducted had been conducting an experiment at a single recently restored grassland, at Mounds View Grassland. For those unfamiliar, this is another prairie enthusiast site undergoing piecemeal land acquisition and restoration. Because of its large size and active management, experiences relatively less encroachment and invasion compared to smaller remnants and is a really great site for experimentation. We established 8 replicate blocks, each containing 3 fire treatments applied in 20 square meter plots. No fire, annual spring fire in April, and annual fall fire in November to December. This photo was taken shortly after a fall fire, so you can actually see the blackened plot there, but you can also see the unmanaged plot to the left and spring burn plot to the right, surrounded by mowed fire breaks. Within each fire treatment, we nested snow removal treatment to simulate reduced snowpack conditions. Unlike the rainout shelters we used in the previous experiment, after much trial and error, we realized there wasn't a good way to automate this process, so we manually removed snowfall every time snow accumulated to over 4 inches. And this was done just in 2 square meter subplots to make this at all feasible of an endeavor. And then within those 2 square meter plots, we had further nested 1 square meter subplots, which is where we collected data to assess the impacts of these combined fire and snow treatments. This experiment's been underway since 2016, and today I'll be focusing on the results from the first 7 years of the study. As with the first experiment, this wouldn't have been possible without strong collaboration with land managers and research partners. In particular, I want to thank Rich Henderson, the land steward at Mounds View Grassland, as well as our collaborators at Adaptive Restoration, who've ensured timely burns for this project year after year. A huge thanks to our field crews as well, especially those who braved winter conditions to shovel snow and collect data, a task that is just as cold and exhausting as it sounds. And I'd also like to acknowledge a different set of co-authors on this work, doctors Ellen Damshin, John Henn, and Christopher Warnicki, along with graduate student Michelle Homan. John was the original developer of this work while in graduate school, and Michelle has continued the project since my departure. And this continuity is really rare and cool for long-term experimentation. So to assess how reduced winter snowpack alters fire seasonality's effects on environmental conditions, we installed temperature loggers that continuously collected data between our fall and spring burns. Here we're going to look at the effects of fire treatment and the average minimum daily temperatures recorded during December, January, and February. On the horizontal axis are those treatments, and the vertical axis that temperature. And we're going to distinguish the 2 snowpack categories, ambient or reduced, with dark grayish and light blue colors, respectively. One of the most striking patterns we observed was that fall fire consistently resulted in lower winter temperatures, on average about 8 degrees Fahrenheit colder than no fire or spring fire treatments. So this suggests that removing litter before winter really does expose soil to colder conditions and reduces the insulating effect that would otherwise buffer those extremes. We also found an interaction between fire and snowpack reduction, such that in the spring fire treatment, reduced snowpack lowered winter temperatures pretty much to the same level as fall fire. However, this interaction effect wasn't observed in the fall fire treatment, meaning snow removal did not lead to even more low temperature. And this might just be because the fall fire on its own already does that well enough. These same trends that you're seeing for minimum temperature do carry over for the timing of spring thaw, where fall fire plots thawed earlier than no fire and spring fire, and the reduced snowpack caused spring fires to thaw quicker. To assess how fire seasonality and reduced snowpack affect plant diversity, we again looked at a number of metrics, but to cut to the chase here, despite those clear environmental changes affecting winter temperature, we have found no significant effect on overall species diversity. As in the first experiment, though, this doesn't mean that species are not shifting. It just simply means that those shifts aren't reflected in a net gain or loss in total diversity. It's possible that species are responding in ways that these diversity metrics don't fully capture. So, to gain a deeper understanding of how plant communities are changing, we looked beyond diversity and focused on functional traits to predict community shifts across treatments. Functional traits are measurable plant characteristics that influence how a species interacts with its environment, including its ability to tolerate stress and compete for resources. Collecting functional traits for many species can be data intensive, but my lab group's been doing this for over a decade, so I was able to pick from a number of traits related to stress tolerance to understand how this might predict plants' responses to this experimental treatment. For example, specific leaf area is a measure of leaf size relative to its dry mass, and it's an indicator of the plant's growth strategy. When you have high specific leaf area, you tend to grow quickly, but are not very stress tolerant, where if you have low specific leaf area, thicker leaves, you tend to be more conservative in resource use, slower growing, but fairly stress adapted. Plant height is another key example where you can have taller plants having more competitive ability and shorter plants might be a little bit more hardy. But perhaps most relevant to this experiment, we looked at cold tolerance, which is a measurement using a thermal camera that captures when 50% of leaf tissue dies due to freezing in a supercooling chamber. Cold tolerance provides insights into which species are best adapted for these winter stresses and freeze-thaw cycles. So to synthesize multiple traits like these, we used a principal components analysis, which reduces a high-dimensional data set into key axes of variation. In simpler terms, this just boils down to a complex of trait data flattened out into two major dimensions that capture differences in plant strategies based on their functional traits. In this case, the first principal component axis primarily reflected a trade-off from large to small species, where the second principal component axis, the vertical axis, reflected a trade-off between stress tolerance and resource acquisition. Meaning that stress-tolerant species invested in survival under harsh conditions, but typically grow more slowly, while resource-acquisitive species prioritize fast growth, but are more sensitive to stress. For example, big blue stem and sky blue aster. So big blue stem and sky blue aster represent large and small species respectively that are both fairly stress tolerant, whereas white mulberry and black medic are large and small species that both represent high resource acquisitiveness. We use this trade-off represented by the second principal components axis to run models that assess how plant function influenced species abundance and colonization throughout the experiment. This graph helps summarize these model outputs showing whether stress tolerance or resource acquisition was favored for increasing abundance or colonization relative to no fire and ambient snow conditions. So values below 0 indicate stress-tolerant species were more likely to increase in abundance or colonize, while values above 0 indicate resource-acquisitive species were more likely to increase in abundance or colonize. And only the filled-in points are going to be significant. So first, looking at abundance, we found that stress tolerance was favored under spring fire, regardless of snow conditions. This could be linked to the relationship between stress tolerance and cold tolerance, where species can handle environmental stress, are also better at persisting under variable winter conditions, though it's unclear why this also wouldn't have been true for the fall fire treatment. Looking at colonization, we found that resource-acquisitive species increased across all treatments relative to no fire and ambient snow conditions. This makes sense because fast-growing species are most likely to establish quickly as new space opens up with fire, and stress tolerance might not be necessary in the short term as they're colonizing these areas. More interesting to me, though, is that we saw stress-tolerant species were more likely to colonize those fall-burned, fall fire, and reduced snow plots. This is likely because this combination is one of the harsher winter conditions, and having stress-tolerant traits makes you better adapted to colonize those spaces. These subtle shifts in the short term indicated by functional traits may indicate early stages of whole community climate-driven change. And while we're in year 7, we hope to make it to year 10 or beyond to further assess that. Okay, to summarize, let's revisit a key takeaway from this experiment, just one big one. We found that fall fire consistently exposed soils to colder winter temperatures, while spring fire combined with reduced snowpack also contributed to greater winter temperature extremes. So the timing of fire and its interaction with snowpack can influence freeze-thaw cycles and plant overwintering conditions. While fire and snowpack loss didn't significantly alter overall species diversity, we observed clear shifts in plant functional strategies. Notably, fall burns combined with reduced snowpack favored the establishment of those stress-tolerant colonizers. Across both experiments, our results provide actionable insights for management, we hope, but also have a number of areas that are uncertain and warrant further research. So I'll wrap up shortly here just by introducing the idea of adaptive management, one that many of you might be familiar with. This figure outlines a structured approach that helps land managers assess, implement, and adjust strategies in response to new information, something that's particularly important as climate change alters the effectiveness of traditionally used management tools. So the research I presented today builds on previous research identifying key threats. Through these experiments, we're able to assess how those threats translate into real-world impacts. And in the longer term, we're beginning to understand which species may be most vulnerable to climate change based on these functional trait approaches. But there's still a lot of research gaps that need to be addressed. Even if we know which strategies work, we need to understand how climate change is affecting our ability to implement them. And that's a lot of the research I'm working on now at the Institute on the Environment in collaboration with the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. Feel free to ask me more about that. But for now, I want to wrap up and just end by saying this collaboration between management, practitioners, and scientists helps this adaptive management cycle and is really critical to helping us find solutions to climate change. Okay, happy to take with the 10 or so minutes we have left any questions.
Well, first, just thank you so much, Catherine. This is really fascinating research, so thank you for sharing with all of us. I also just want to have a quick note that there has been some research covering the timing of fires being done earlier in the fall versus the spring and summer, as you indicated. Our ecologist, Dr. Dan Carter, has posted some information about those sources in the chat for those of you interested in exploring the issue of timing for prescribed burning more closely.
Thank you. That's great. Thanks, Dan.
Yeah, no problem. So you kind of briefly talked about where your research is going from here, but I'm wondering, will you continue to measure the management impact over a longer period of time? Jonathan Hampt, one of our attendees, was wondering whether C4 grasses might increase over time if management interventions are maintained because of increased light penetration.
Yeah, one would certainly think. We currently are not still assessing the impacts in the first experiment that I talked about, at least not on an annual basis, though we have permanent plot markers out, and I would love to revisit that someday. That said, it's going to be interesting to see whether these chemical interventions, though they were effective at preventing resprouting in a 3-year time frame, my guess is that because there's a lot of woody plants still around these plots, that the effects of that management might not last all that much longer. A hope would be to reapply the management and see what happens in the next 5 years or so. That would be great because yes, I do think that C4 grasses in a longer time frame would start to benefit more, obviously.
Wonderful, thank you. An attendee, Susan Harris, has observed that dealing with increased drought in association with stronger and more variable winds due to climate change is making fire management more dangerous. Can you comment on the use of mowing or brush hog for management?
That's a great question. Yeah, I love that observation. The shift in our ability to apply prescribed fire is of big interest to me as a researcher in my current position. But yes, I think the option of using mowing or grazing or hog control for applying some kind of disturbance is certainly better than nothing. That said, I think that there's particular benefits that fire provides that those other types of disturbances don't entirely make up for. For example, fire volatilizes nutrients in a way that other types of disturbance don't. Those other types of disturbance tend to be more heterogeneous. Fire certainly can be too, but on a much more localized scale. So I think that they're better than nothing. Do I think that they're the best long-term solution? I hope we can find a way to keep using fire too.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, Dr. Dan Carter was wondering whether you have investigated if stress tolerance is associated with old growth association of the high coefficients of conservation in your data set.
I have not. I would encourage the question asker to look at some of the research from Amy Alstead and or Laura Ladwig, who have been helping to see whether frequent fire and the associated functional traits, stress tolerant traits, can predict or relates to like this old growth or these remnant prairies. And a brief summary of their work from the top of my head is that there is a relationship between high quality intact remnant prairies and stress tolerance, so that frequent fire systems that have never been tilled do seem to have more cold tolerant and other types of stress tolerant traits at a community-wide level. So it's certainly a reason to keep conserving and preserving those grasslands that have not yet been converted, because they're probably in a much better place than restorations, which is where we were doing this stress tolerance or cold tolerance experiment.
Okay. Christy Taylor has asked whether there may be a potential benefit with respect to pest insect population reductions when soil isn't insulated over the winter.
Hmm. A benefit, yeah, because you're getting more cold exposure, so you might have pests die off. I'm not sure. That's a really interesting question. And it actually reminds me that I need to get in touch again with my collaborators, because we have schemed up whether we could do some work on insects in these same plots. Granted, insects move around a lot more than plants, making it harder, but certainly some of the slightly less mobile organisms, it would be really fascinating to see. Maybe not so much at the scale of the snow shoveling, which is only 4 square meters, but at these 200 square meter fire plots, you might see some differences, and that could be attributed to different thermal regulation throughout the winter. One more note on that, because I don't actually know about insects, but I do know we've seen changes in our microbial community and thus in soil respiration rates amongst these different fire treatments. And I think that's a similar mechanism driving those changes that would drive insect changes as well.
Very interesting. Um, so Gary Erickson has an interesting question. He's wondering whether there's any evidence that climate change may move the traditional prairie limits northerly. Will it make conversion of former ag lands north of the historical limits to prairie a reasonable expectation?
I think certainly so. And I think habit or land that is already agricultural and goes foul is a great opportunity for prairie restoration. I think that at the same time, I mean, as we're already seeing in the current extent of the tallgrass prairie, conversion to forest is a big concern, and southern forests are going to move north as well. And so whether that would happen naturally or would only happen because we're choosing to restore areas north to prairie, I think the latter approach is what we need to push prairie north. I don't think it would happen maybe naturally. That's a
Okay.
cool idea though.
All right, I'm going to move on to a question from James McGee, who commented that in degraded prairie pastures at Nachusa grasslands, after brush has been cleared, non-native cool season grasses colonize. However, with burning and seeding over time, prairie species tend to take over cool season grasses. What have you observed in your research?
That sounds like a very similar pattern, although it seems like there's a little bit more of a temporal span in what's being done at Nachusa in terms of them having seen kind of these later longer term effects play out. I imagine it would be quite similar, and I've been in discussion with all the managers at the sites where we did this woody encroachment experiment, and they are great at getting fire on the ground. Most of those are on a 2 to 3 year fire return interval. And so I do think that there's a very good chance where we've done that management that the cool season would start to get knocked back, especially if we could do spring fires, and that those C4s would start to do better again. And I will say too, we did seed in this experiment. I didn't talk about this much, but we had really poor recruitment. So I don't know if overseeding in later years, as we start to get fire and C4 grasses more dominant, maybe the seeds would do better then. But at least in the second year of the study, which is when we put a pretty high density seeding mix in, we didn't see recruitment.
Okay. Well, we are almost at time. I'd like to ask one more question because our attendees are just so impressed with you, Catherine.
Oh,
I'd
thank you.
love to know if you'd be willing to share what first sparked your passion for native ecosystems.
Oh, I love that question. I have always loved the natural world. I think I fell in love with plants and especially plants in ecosystems like prairies because I think it's amazing the strategy and the diversity of strategies plants have developed to survive harsh conditions. I love stressed out little plants and putting them through the ringer and seeing how they're able to withstand it. I think it's so cool. I think our ecosystems are really resilient. And to end on a positive note, it gives me a lot of hope to see all this natural strategy for responding to stress, that if we can harness that, they're going to be okay.
Mm. Well, thank you so much, Catherine. I love ending on that note. Thank you for sharing your passion. Thank you for sharing your knowledge.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone for being here and with this presentation. So just a quick housekeeping note, our next presentation starts at 3:30, and that is with Bolton and Menk, one of our sponsors. But thank you again, Catherine, and we'll see you all in the next session. Bye, everyone.